This is really bothering me. To think that there's commanders who requested Starlink and did a lot of work to get Starlink on the front line, risking soldiers and aid workers and delivery men, only to be told the purpose that they asked for Starlink in the first place is no longer viable. Let's talk SpaceX, okay? Let's talk about SpaceX. So I recently did a really big piece on SpaceX on my main channel, DylanBurnsTV, about Elon Musk, how SpaceX got to be operating in Ukraine, how useful it has been in coordinating drone strikes and coordinating command and control and communications, and the efforts that a lot of aid workers have gone through to deliver Starlink to the front lines, as well as some solutions to the problems that Starlink has faced in Ukraine, as funding issues, service outages, all these problems. And there was two things that I think are important for the story we're about to read. One was the fact that there have been multiple reports of service outages in active combat operations on the front line, meaning that while Starlink is being used on the front line, it goes out. And this was supposedly, according to CNN, connected to funding issues. And then there's the second issue. And the second issue is that, and this was after, though, when talking about the funding issue, that Elon Musk said he would keep funding it even if nobody paid for it. Second issue was that I think that the Starlink relationship that Elon Musk has with Ukraine has to be like written down in contract form. There has to be a contract that clearly dictates the terms and conditions of the relationship, so we can't just magically midway through the war have Elon Musk say, like some have suggested he did, that they're not going to allow, that Elon will not allow Starlink to be used in Crimea. And if that's true, that is severely undercutting the usefulness of Starlink in conducting offensive operations to retake all of Ukrainian territory. And so that's why I think it needs to be clearly laid out in a contract, so Elon Musk can't later just be like, oh, whoopsies, never mind. Well, one of the worst case scenarios is happening. Not the worst, which would be Starlink is completely cutting services and won't be engaged in communications, but SpaceX has publicly admitted that they have blocked Ukrainian troops from using satellite technology. They are blocking Ukrainian troops from using the satellite technology, specifically when it comes to coordinating drone strikes. So let's read the article and we're going to talk about it. The president of SpaceX revealed the company has taken active steps to prevent Ukrainian forces from using the critical Starlink satellite technology with Ukrainian drones that are a key component of their fight against Russia. There are things that we can do to limit their ability to do that, Shotwell told reporters on Wednesday, referencing reports on Starlink and drone use. There are things we can do and have done. Starlink was never meant to be used militarily in the way that it has, Shotwell argued, saying the company didn't foresee how profoundly and creatively Ukrainian forces would rely on the technology. It was never intended to be weaponized, Shotwell told an audience at the space conference. However, Ukrainians have leveraged it in ways that were unintentional and not part of any agreement. Shotwell's admission that SpaceX, which was founded by Elon Musk, has prevented Ukrainian soldiers from fully using the technology confirms the long-standing belief that Musk and the company are uneasy with Ukraine's military use of Starlink. Speaking with reporters after, Shotwell argued that Starlink had sent units to Ukraine to keep the banks going, hospitals, and keep families connected. We know the military is using them for comms, and that's okay, Shotwell added, but our intent was never to have them use it for offensive purposes. Last October, Musk angered Ukrainians, including President Volodymyr Zelensky, for proposing a peace plan on Twitter that argued Ukraine could just give up efforts to reclaim Crimea and seize control of Luhansk and Donetsk regions. That same month, there were reports that Starlink signal had been restricted and was not available past the front lines as Ukrainian troops tried to advance, essentially hamstringing their efforts to retake territory from the Russians. This reports of outages fueled accusations that Musk was kowtowing to Russia. That has affected every effort of the Ukrainians to push past that front, a person familiar with the outages told CNN in October. Starlink is the main ways units on the battlefield have to communicate. So, now, this is most of the story. You can keep and you can read the rest of it. But when it comes to Starlink and it comes to its military usage, I do not buy this excuse. The Elon Musk and Starlink could have objected or had this conversation behind closed doors or something before this point, or could have laid out that they were not going to be used for that in advance, or as it was being made public that they were being used for that, gone behind closed doors and had these discussions. It was only after 25,000 Starlink terminals enter Ukraine, many of them paid by the Ukrainian government, many of them paid for by other governments like the American government, the British government, the Polish government, all these different groups paid for Starlink terminals, paid for the service. 80% of the Starlink terminals in Ukraine, I believe, have been already paid for, not donated by Elon Musk. While some of it is charity, a lot of it isn't. Only after all these divisions have been made reliant on Starlink, and now they've got over 25,000 operating in the country, being used for any number of military purposes. Now, once they've got the leverage and they don't have a contract restricting them from saying, no this, no that, you can't use this, you can't use that. Now that they're reliant on it, that's when they say, no, you can't use them for this purpose. Yes, we're denying them from using that to this purpose. Also, outages along the front line. This stuff, Starlink has been extremely helpful for the Ukrainian military in Ukraine, and has been very helpful for just general Ukrainian governance in Ukraine when it comes to keeping people connected, keeping hospitals connected, keeping the government connected to the people, and making sure that emergency services has communication. I mean, it has been extremely helpful. And in my video, my big video on my main channel, DylanBurnsTV, about Starlink, I try to emphasize that to a large degree. But now that all these satellites have been paid for, now that not all of them, but many of them have been paid for, now that a lot of these terminals have been paid for, either by the Ukrainian government, Polish government, the UK government, and now that Starlink is really part of Ukrainian defense infrastructure, now is when all these new terms are being added. And just to remind you guys, this is after the scandal reported on by Ian Bremmer that Elon Musk called Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin told him directly that if the Ukrainians try to retake Crimea, the world will explode. We're going to use nuclear weapons. And that's what motivated Elon Musk to say you cannot use it in Crimea. Now, Elon denies this. Ian Bremmer says that he got this information from Musk, but this stuff is starting to look more and more and more suspicious, even if we don't have any concrete proof. And I do want to emphasize that Ukrainians are going to see those dots and they're going to connect them. Talking to Ukrainians, many of them at the start of the war had a pretty generally positive view of Elon Musk, not due to any of his other endeavors, but due to the fact that he had sent Starlink to Ukraine on February 26th, 2 days into the invasion, after being asked to. It was extremely helpful, and the Ukrainian people appreciated that. But as the war has gone on, and there's been reports of shortage outages, there's been reports of him, possibly calling Vladimir Putin and talking to him about not using Starlink in Crimea, after all the stories broke about his, proposed peace plan, which would see Ukraine lose large swaths of territory that is internationally recognized as Ukrainian territory, and him saying that the Eastern Ukrainians want to be part of Russia and they welcomed the Russian army. Like, this is like some really ridiculous stuff. His reputation has continued to spiral more and more and more and more in the minds of many Ukrainians. And it's only going to continue to get worse if he keeps making decisions like this. Look, if he wants all of it to be paid for, that's understandable. But he made the commitment after getting so much backlash that he was going to pay for it. And now, all of a sudden, now that the whole system is somewhat reliant on Starlink, now he's going to say that you cannot use it to coordinate drone strikes to retake what is rightfully Ukrainian territory. Not to mention, we say, in offensive operations, but a lot of these drones are being used in locations to defend against the Russian army, which is advancing. One of the locations we just talked about today where the Russian army had a major loss was south of Bakhmut, where they lost over 30 vehicles, in part due to drones being coordinated by the Ukrainian army right here in Volodya. I never know how to pronounce it correctly. Over 30 vehicles destroyed, in part due to drones that were coordinated by the military. Was that not defensive? If the Russian army is trying to take a village and you use drones to defend your village, is that defensive? I mean, it's offensive in the way that they're using weapons to kill soldiers, but this is a defensive war. This just feels silly to me. And the thing that really angers me is I've met many of the people who have delivered Starlink to the front lines. They have gotten shelled. Some of them have gotten hurt while making these deliveries. People put their life on the line to get Starlink's SpaceX pet project to the front lines of the war, really risking it all to do this. And now that all these people have risked their lives after 25,000 times, 25,000 terminals in the country, now is when we make the decision, well, actually, you can't use it for this purpose. Well, actually, and they're going to start reeling it in more and more and more and more. This makes me very uncomfortable. Nobody remembers this being a term or part of the agreement at the start. This is why they needed to have their terms and conditions fleshed out at the start. And I understand, and I talked about this on my video on the main channel, I understand that there was a war going on, the Russians were invading, and they didn't have a lot of time to organize this. But the war has been going on for almost a year now. In 14 days, on February 24th, this war will be going on for a year. In 16 days, on February 26th, SpaceX's relationship with Starlink will be over a year old. These terms and conditions should have been flushed out months ago. So we wouldn't have confusion around this. We wouldn't have the outages. We wouldn't have these surprising pop-up new terms and conditions of the usage of the Starlink terminals. Because a lot of these divisions that are using Starlink, if they knew they couldn't use it to coordinate drone strikes, they wouldn't have gotten Starlink. From the video that I uploaded on my channel, let's see if we can bring this up quickly. From the video on my main channel, the Starlink video.
Russian-occupied territory.
Which did okay. That's sitting at 50K views. It's doing pretty good. In this, you can see footage of soldiers delivering, not soldiers, but aid workers delivering a Starlink terminal. Let's see if we can get to it. Right here. Here they are, loading up the Starlink terminal. They're heading to the area around Popasna. This is where what the map looked like at the time that they were making the delivery, as the Russians were trying to close out the pocket. The reason why the Ukrainian defenders, because the Ukrainian general was actually the one asking for the Starlink. I think it was a Ukrainian general or some Ukrainian officer. I forget a specific role, but he was asking for the Starlink because he wanted to use it in defending the villages that the Russians were trying to capture. So that makes me believe, or at least assume to some degree, that Starlink terminal was being used to coordinate drone strikes. Does that mean this delivery now has been reduced in its effectiveness? That use that they were trying to get out of the Starlink is now not possible? How much has this made a lot of these deliveries partially, if not completely, ineffective? This is really bothering me. To think that there's commanders who requested Starlink and did a lot of work to get Starlink on the front line, risking soldiers and aid workers and delivery men, only to be told the purpose that they asked for Starlink in the first place is no longer viable. But they've already trained their soldiers on how to use Starlink. Their soldiers have gotten used to using Starlink. And now what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to switch out to some new system. They're going to have an expensive system for Starlink to deal with command and control and communication, possibly, and who knows how long this will last, possibly to monitor soldiers, be able to watch soldiers through drone footage, through live footage, maybe, who knows how long that'll last. And then they're going to need a separate system to coordinate drone strikes, just making it more burdensome, more complicated, requiring more training, pointlessly. What's the purpose? What is benefited by Elon Musk stopping this? Does this, end the war? It doesn't end the war. Does this make it easier for the Ukrainians to defend their country? No, it makes it more difficult for them to defend their country. Does this increase the effectiveness of Starlink? No, it actively decreases the effectiveness of the over 25,000 Starlink terminals that are operating in Ukraine that they rely on to survive. I'm really disappointed by this, and I'm happy I got my piece out when I did, because now I kind of feel like, you know, I don't want to do like a told you so moment, but one of my big points at the end, because at the end I do a segment on what can be done about this issue. How do we deal with the fact that there's been so many outages and there's all these issues surrounding Starlink, and the fact that the Pentagon and Ukrainian officials don't 100% trust Elon Musk to be 100% reliable when it comes to this issue. Now I kind of feel like a little bit like, yeah, I do feel like a little bit I told you so. Like, the terms and conditions should have been set out a month or 2 months into Starlink's usage. And I think if it would have been, then a lot of these issues with the outages, a lot of these issues with now restricting the effectiveness of Starlink in defending Ukraine could have been 100% avoided. Now, putting all that to the side, why is Elon Musk doing this? Why is SpaceX doing this? And I do not have an answer for you. I do not have an answer for you. I do not know why Elon Musk or Starlink would actively undermine the potential effectiveness of what their tools can be used for. Because I've talked to soldiers. Some have problems with Starlink because there's a problem with overcongestion and possibly slow usage in some areas. But others have been very, have praised Starlink for its effectiveness and usefulness, and sometimes even ease of use on the battlefield. Why make it so you're putting more barriers in between your product and its usefulness to the people using your product? I see somebody in Gutter Chat just said maybe he's a Vatnik. I mean, I don't know if he supports Russia. I can't read his mind. I don't think he supports Russia. If he did, he probably would completely pull support for Starlink, and he wouldn't have set Starlink in the first place. But I do think that he has, to some degree, fallen under the influence of Russian talking points. Whether it was the fact that he said that the handing over of Crimea to Ukraine was a mistake by the Soviet Union when he said that, or whether he suggested that the majority of Eastern Ukrainians want to be part of Russia, or whether that time he said that maybe the Ukrainians should just, give up a lot of this territory. Those were Russian talking points. There's no polling data that reflects the majority of Eastern Ukrainians wanting to be part of Ukraine. He even couldn't find any polling data to reflect that, so he had to use election data of the amount of Eastern Ukrainians who voted for Yanukovych in 2012. And I don't think you need to be a genius to understand that voting for Yanukovych does not necessarily translate into wanting to be part of Russia. Not to mention, there is polling data available on the amount of Eastern Ukrainians before the invasion that wanted to be part of Russia, and there's no data showing that it was a majority. So why is he falling under the influence of these talking points? Well, Ian Bremmer would have you believe it's because he's directly communicating with Vladimir Putin. And I have no reason to doubt Ian Bremmer. I mean, is there any concrete evidence of it? No. But Ian Bremmer isn't known to be a liar. He's a pretty reputable guy. So why would he say that? Elon Musk's response has always been that he did technically talk to Putin, but it was before the war in 2019. But I don't know who I believe. I really don't. Either way, I think whether he heard it directly out of the horse's mouth of Vladimir Putin, whether he heard it through Russian state talking points and RT or just randos on Twitter like Kim.com repeating these talking points for a Western audience, I do think he is starting to have these viewpoints somewhat influence how he views the war. It was just a few days ago that Elon Musk ended up responding to a tweet that said that over 2,000 NATO soldiers have died in the war. But no NATO soldiers have died in the war. And this comes from Elon Musk, the guy who, claims to care so much about media literacy. This is unbelievably frustrating. While I do think that he still vaguely supports Ukraine, he is still trying to help Ukraine somewhat with Starlink, there is no good reason for him to undermine Starlink's effectiveness in being able to coordinate drone strikes. It helps the Ukrainians defend themselves more. The more effective the Ukrainian military will be, the length of this war can be shortened through that effectiveness. And he's just making it more difficult for run-of-the-mill Ukrainian soldiers who are going to have to be operating with his systems. This is unbelievably frustrating. I really don't know why he's letting these talking points flood into his head, or what the plan is here, but the terms and conditions of this agreement with Starlink need to be fleshed out, and this was a terrible decision by Elon Musk and a terrible decision by Starlink. It really just feels like undermining the good work that Starlink has done in Ukraine. I'm very disappointed.